I did a lot of travelling when I was in my early 20s, and one of the places that I will never forget is Rome, but probably not for the reasons you're thinking. Now, don't get me wrong, Rome is a beautiful city, and I had a great time exploring it and doing all the usual touristy stuff. I went to the Colosseum and the ruins of the Roman Forum, I threw coins into the Trevi Fountain and marvelled at the architecture. I visited the Pantheon, I climbed the Spanish Steps, and ate more pizza and ice cream than I have in my life. Honestly, the food there is incredible. I highly recommend going if you get the chance. But despite all that, I've never been back, and honestly, I don't know that I ever will, because as awesome as the city is, my strongest memory of it will always be something darker and something that, after all this time, I still can't wrap my head around. I was solo backpacking on this trip because none of my friends were free to come with me, and life's too short to wait for other people to do the things you really want to do. If anyone is considering a solo trip but is a little unsure, just go for it, I promise. Unless you have my sort of luck, you won't end up regretting it. It was my second day in Rome, and the first night I'd been there, I'd been pretty wiped out from the travelling, so I'd had an early night and caught up on some sleep, or at least caught up on as much sleep as I was going to be able to while staying in a dorm room with no air conditioning in the middle of summer. But that night, I wanted to have a few drinks and go out, so I bought a few beers at the local shop to pre-game while I got ready, and as often happens when you're staying in dorms and you have alcohol, I ended up chatting with one of the guys in my room. His name was Jordan and he was from New Zealand and in the middle of a solo trip around Europe. Anyway, we had a couple of beers before heading down to the bar in the basement of the hostel we were staying in. The bar was already pretty full when we got there, and it had an energetic vibe to it, so we grabbed a couple more drinks, we chatted it up with a few people and did some shots, and we were just generally having a really good time. One thing I found about Italian drinking culture during my time there is that it's a lot more sophisticated than in the UK. This was just my experience, and so it may not be true, but they don't tend to binge drink in the way that people tend to do on nights out in the UK. Rather than cramming into nightclubs, people tended to meet up with friends in these squares that are dotted about and just have a few casual drinks. And like I say, this was just my experience, so if I'm wrong, please do let me know in the comments below. I say all this because being in a hostel full of young people from across the world, the culture tends to be a bit more rowdy with more alcohol consumed. But the bar we were in didn't stay open very late, so the hostel put on a bus to shuttle its guests down to the river where there was this open air bar so that people could stay up later and have a few more drinks if they wanted to. Me and Jordan weren't quite ready to call it a night yet. It's not like we had anywhere to be the next morning. I was on holiday and Jordan was in the middle of his backpacking trip. So we crammed ourselves onto that bus with everyone else and we headed to the bar. And as soon as we got there, we knew we'd made the right decision. It looked great. The bar sat at the bottom of these set of stairs, right up against the river, with these white canopies set up over the countertops where they were serving the drinks. They strung up all these fairy lights overhead to light up the area, and the full moon was reflecting in the river as it flowed by. It looked like something out of an advertisement. Honestly, I felt a little bit out of place in my jeans and trainers, but no one else seemed to mind, so hey, I wasn't going to let it stop me having a good time. Me and Jordan made a beeline to the bar to grab a couple drinks before the rest of our bus emptied out and the queues got too long. We still had to wait a few minutes to get served, but that gave us a chance to take a look around and really appreciate the beauty of this place. The vibe in this bar was super chill, everyone around us seemed to be having a great time, and the music was on point. One thing I really hate about most bars is they have the music way too loud, to the point where you can barely hear yourself think and end up shouting into each other's ears just to be heard. But here they had the volume just right, quiet enough to be able to hold a conversation, but loud enough to hear over the general buzz. Like I said, it was just a super chilled out spot. And I was just appreciating all that when these two girls pulled up to the bar next to us. And these two girls couldn't have looked more different than each other, yet both of them were stunningly beautiful. I don't like to rank girls out of 10, it just feels a bit demeaning, but to provide some context, these girls were easily 9s or 9.5s. Now, I was young, dumb and single at the time, not to mention a good few bottles of bad decision juice deep, and filled with the kind of faux confidence that that brings. So I decided to shoot my shot because what did I really have to lose? I introduced myself and Jordan, trying to get a conversation flowing, so I'm cracking a few jokes, and surprisingly, they seem into it and they're giving us some banter back. And as these things always go, the conversation quickly turned to what we were doing in Rome and what we'd already done when the girls brought up that we had to go and see the Vatican City. And it actually got a little odd with how insistent they were that we had to go and visit the Vatican. But I just figured that they'd been that day and really enjoyed it and just wanted to share that joy with others. And me and Jordan had actually spoken about it earlier that night, and neither of us had been yet. So we were already planning to go there the next day. So I just held up my hands and said, "Yo, you've already made the sale. We'll make sure we check it out tomorrow. You can stop selling." And when I said that, their faces lit up like I just told two kids that I was taking them to Disneyland. At that point, the barman approached, going to the girls first as most barmen do, and the girls offered to buy us a round of drinks. And I've just got to say, I really appreciated that. I know there are some girls who expect the guy to always pay, or even flirt with guys at bars just to get free drinks, then ignore the guys after. But the fact that they were offering to get the first round in told me that they weren't like that, and they were actually interested in continuing our conversation. So while we waited for the drinks, Jordan asked them more about their plans, and he asked them specifically if they were planning to visit the Vatican themselves, which, seeing how enthusiastic they were about us visiting, it seemed like a no-brainer that they would also be going. But again, their response was a little bit odd. They looked at each other and giggled, like they were sharing some sort of inside joke. Then Maeve, "It's not really a place for girls like us." And like I said, that struck me as a super odd thing to say, and I shoot Jordan a look to see if he found anything about that interaction a little bit off, but he seemed oblivious. And before I could ask what they meant, the barman finished serving the drinks, and the girls pulled us over to a table that they had reserved over by the river. So we keep the conversation going, and everything else seems fine, so I just let those odd comments slide. And at some point, Maeve and Ava's three other friends came over and joined us. And again, all three of them were super attractive, but in different ways. And each of them had a guy with them. Now, we recognized the three guys that were with them from the hostel as one of the groups that we had chatted to back in the hostel bar. It got to maybe 1 a.m. and the bar was just starting to wind down when one of the girls got him one last round of drinks for the road and suggested we take the party back to their villa on the outskirts of Rome. Like I said, we were all young, dumb, and pretty drunk, and with Maeve's hand in mine, I would have crawled back to that villa if I had to. But one thing I learned from all my time travelling, with all the drinking that is usually involved, is the importance of knowing your limits and stopping before you hit that level of drunk where you're completely gone. I'd been trying to pace myself as the night had worn on, alternating between water and beer, but I was at that point now where I knew I was close to the edge and that one more drink might just be the one that tipped me over the edge. But at the same time, I didn't want to be rude, so as the others knocked back their drinks, I took a few sips of my beer, just waiting for the right time to swap my bottle out for one of the empty ones on the table, so if anyone checked, it would look like I had finished my drink. And I thought getting a taxi might prove difficult given there was 10 of us, but I was one of the last ones up the flight of stairs back to the street, and by the time I got up there, they'd managed to flag down a minivan taxi to bundle all of us into. And the taxi had been driving for maybe 15 minutes when this wave of exhaustion hit me like nothing I've ever felt before. My eyes were getting heavier by the second, and no matter how hard I tried to wake myself up, I just couldn't seem to shake it off. I managed to turn my head to look back at everyone else in the cab just to see how they were all doing, and a jolt of fear ran through me as I realised that every one of the other guys was passed out cold. But the girls were all clearly wide awake, and each one of them was staring back at me, and they had these knowing grins on their faces. The next thing I know, I'm waking up, my head pounding, my body aches, and there's a sharp pain in my right hand. It takes a little bit for my memories to fully come back, so I'm just laying there waiting for the fog to clear when I hear voices behind me. And at the same moment, I remember everything that happened, and I'm so grateful that I hadn't moved yet. And I can hear enough that I recognise the voices belong to Maeve and Ava, but I can't quite catch what they're talking about. But I am pretty sure that I hear the word blood mentioned, and that did absolutely nothing to ease my worries. And I'm just still laying there completely still because clearly those girls drugged us, and I had no idea what kind of situation I was waking up to, and the only advantage that I had was that they didn't know that I was awake yet. They didn't know that I hadn't drank all that beer, that I'd only had a few sips before I swapped out the bottle. As far as they knew, I'd finished it off like everyone else, and I would be out cold for the rest of the night. After a couple minutes, I hear their footsteps walking away, so I crack open one eye, just enough to take a quick look ahead, but not enough that it would be immediately obvious to anyone that might be watching me. But I can't see that there's anyone watching me, and I can't hear any sign of the girls returning just yet, so I open both eyes and I risk a quick look around. I'm lying on a poorly lit patio outside some villa. The only real light is coming from the full moon overhead. I mean, there was a little bit of light coming from the window of the villa, but the blinds were down, so it's not like the light was spilling out onto the patio. My right hand is still stinging, and when I look down it, I can see a jagged cut across the palm, and the rest of the hand is stained red. But I know that there's nothing I can do for that wound right now, so I ignore it and I focus on my surroundings. In the faint light, I can see these odd lines painted in red on the patio tiles, and two of those lines joined together at the point where I was laying, like I was at the point of a triangle. And as I'm looking at these lines, I realise two things. First, the lines were part of a larger shape, and that shape was a pentagram with a circle around the outside and these weird symbols painted everywhere. And in the very middle is this small fire pit, the type that you might use to grill some burgers on a summer's day or roast some marshmallows over while telling ghost stories as a kid. Honestly, it wouldn't have looked out of place in a suburban garden, yet here it was in the middle of a pentagram with what I can only describe as a small cauldron sat on top. And the fire pit wasn't lit or anything, that would have actually been a useful source of light, but I could tell that it had been stocked up with wood, like someone had it set up ready to use. And the second thing I noticed was at each of the points of the pentagram is one of the other guys, and none of them were moving. I take a quick glance around just to make sure I'm still alone. I don't know what kind of crazy I'm dealing with here, so I'm not looking to start any sort of confrontation. I just want to get out of there as quickly as possible, get the police, and let them handle it. I can hear some talking from the window nearest to me, but the voices don't seem to be getting any nearer, so I figure this is probably the best chance that I will get. I dart over to the closest guy as quietly as I can and roll him onto his back. I recognise Jordan immediately, and I try giving him a little shake, a little slap on the cheek, just trying to get any sort of response, but I can tell that he's stone cold out of it. Honestly, if I hadn't felt a pulse, I'd have thought he was dead. And it was then that I realised just how screwed I was. There were 4 guys here. I couldn't carry them all, and I didn't even know where I was or how far I'd have to go to get any sort of help. I didn't know how long I'd been out for. It was still night time, so I know it can't have been all that long, but for all I knew, we weren't even in Rome anymore. I took another look around, hoping I could see something that would help me, and I'm not sure what I was looking for really. Maybe a wheelbarrow or something, but my eyes were just starting to adjust to the darkness, and I could make out the start of what looked like a small forest about maybe 50 meters away, and that was good enough for me. But honestly, I severely underestimated how difficult it would be to pick up Jordan. He's not a particularly big guy or anything, and I like to try and keep myself in decent shape. But have you ever tried to pick up a toddler when they make themselves all floppy and into a dead weight? Imagine that, but with a grown man. But eventually, I managed to get him slung over my shoulder, and I started towards the tree line. And as I went, I threw one of Jordan's shoes around the side of the house in the opposite direction to the one that I was going in. I figured that if they came looking and they found the shoe in that direction, that's where they'd start their search, thinking that we'd made a break for the road rather than going towards the tree line, and that distraction might just buy us an extra few minutes to get away. So I pushed forward into the cover of the tree line, and I had no idea how far these trees went. I could have been on the verge of a vast forest, or it could have just been a small stand of trees. It was impossible to tell in the dark. One thing I could tell immediately, because I almost tripped over, was that the undergrowth beneath the trees was thick and required careful, precise steps to avoid catching my foot as I pushed deeper. And very quickly, it became clear that I wasn't going to be able to go much further into these trees with Jordan over my shoulder. And even if I could, I might be getting further from civilization, and I was still leaving the other 3 guys at the mercy of whatever those girls had planned for us. It's not like I was going to be making it to anywhere that I'd be able to contact the police that night, and my phone had lost all signals, so that was completely useless. Plus, if I pushed too deep and this was some vast forest, there's no guarantee that we'd be able to find our way back out again. I'm not familiar with this area, and going forward blind would make it so easy to get lost. So I did the only thing I could. I found a particularly large bush, and I stashed Jordan in it as best I could so that he'd remain hidden. Then I slowly retraced my steps to the forest edge to see if I could save any of the other guys. As I'm picking my way out of this forest, trying to be as quiet as I can and to not trip on the undergrowth that seems to be everywhere, I'm trying not to eat dirt if I can help it. But I have a minute to think, and I'm trying to figure out just what these girls wanted with us. Obviously it was nothing good, and if they'd just been planning to mug us, why bring us back to the villa? They could have just robbed us blind and dropped us by the side of the road. The only thing that made any sense was that this was some sort of ransom situation, or some sort of human trafficking, or they were planning to harvest our organs for the black market. But none of those answers explained the weird pentagram and the symbols painted on the floor. By the time I make it to the edge of the tree line, I realise that there's no chance I'm pulling off a rescue for the other three guys. The girls are back outside and they look pissed. But that's not what makes me think it's impossible. Standing near them are two massive guys, the kind of guys that warm up for a bench press with my maximum squat weight, and one of them is holding Jordan's shoe. I make sure I'm concealed behind a tree and watch as the other three girls appear to be berating Maeve and Ava, which I guess makes sense. They were the ones that brought me and Jordan along, and I guess it was Maeve's screw up that allowed us to get away. She didn't make sure that I finished my drink, which allowed me to wake up before they could do whatever it was they had planned. I tried to listen to the conversation, but they seemed to be talking in a foreign language that I didn't even recognize, let alone understand. And after a few minutes, they seemed to come to some sort of agreement, but I could tell that none of them were happy about it. I watch as one of them lights the fire pit, the flames lighting up the bodies of the three guys still collapsed on the floor at the points of the pentagram, and from what I can tell, they haven't moved an inch from when I left them. The two muscle-bound guys leave the patio, making their way around the side of the house as Maeve pours a dark liquid into the cauldron. So now it's just the five girls and the three unconscious guys on the patio. The girls position themselves so they're all standing evenly spaced around the cauldron, just outside the pentagram, and I'm just trying to figure out what the heck is going on when I hear them start to chant. It starts quietly but rises and falls, and while I can't understand what it is they're saying, I catch enough of it to recognise that it sounds like Latin. Obviously, I don't speak Latin, and I never hear anyone speak it outside of movies, so I can't really say for sure that it was Latin, but it had that sort of sound to it. And it's at that point that I know that all my previous guesses about what was happening were wrong. This wasn't a mugging or an organ harvesting situation. This was some weird sort of cult type crap, and that made it all the more dangerous, because there was no telling what these people believed and what they were prepared to do. I could be watching the start of a human sacrifice ritual for all I know. I pull out my phone and I start recording, just so that I have some proof, because I know that no one will believe me otherwise, and I want to have some concrete evidence to be able to show the police when I make it back to the city. And as the chanting grew louder, my hand began to sting where it had been cut. It started as just an odd tingle, but it quickly grew sharp and stabbing. I had to bite down on my lip to stop from gasping, and when I looked up, I could see that the three guys on the floor were all squirming in pain as the pain in my hand grew white hot, and I knew that they were all experiencing the exact same pain. And I'm just grimacing down at my hand when suddenly the chanting stops, and as it did, the pain vanished with it, leaving just a dull ache across my palm. And I'm just glancing between the patio and my palm, wondering what the hell had just happened. And it was at that point that I made a connection, and I'm pretty sure that what I'd seen them pour into the cauldron was the blood they'd taken when they'd cut our palms. But it made no sense that that would cause the pain in our palms now. And the blood was still in the cauldron, and the fire was still burning, so if that had been the cause of the pain, it should still be happening. The only other explanation was that it had something to do with the chanting and that had caused the pain. But before I could really think about it anymore, something even more bizarre happened. This dark smoke started to rise up from the cauldron, but rather than just drifting away, it seemed to linger, just hovering over the cauldron, but at the same time it was growing thicker, twisting in on itself and shaping itself into a vaguely human shape. But I was a good distance away, and the only real light was from the flickering flames of the fire pit, so it wasn't until the smoke started moving that I realised it hadn't just formed into one human shape, but five, and each of them was slowly hovering towards one of the points of the pentagram. I wanted to turn and run right at that moment, but I couldn't make myself move. I wanted to say it's because I was being careful and that any noise could have given me away, but I was a good distance away and unlikely to be heard if I turned and walked away. Honestly, I just had to see what was going to happen next. The smoke figures reached the points of the pentagram, and as they reached the point where the three other guys lay, I watched them bend down, and the way they moved, it was more like they were folding in half than actually bending, and to my absolute horror, the smoke slowly started disappearing into the mouths of the three guys. Their bodies started to thrash like they were each having a seizure, and then all of a sudden, they went still. And I'd been so transfixed by this horrifying scene and the ordeal that these poor guys must have been going through, that I hadn't thought to pay attention to the other 2 points of the pentagram, the point where Jordan and I had been laying. Obviously, we'd gotten away, so there were no bodies for the smoke figures to enter. So the two smoke figures were just standing there like they'd been stood up, and I had the horrifying realization they were facing right at me. Okay, so facing might have been the wrong word, as I'm pretty sure they didn't actually have faces, at least not that I could see, but their bodies were definitely angled towards where I was standing, and when I looked at the one standing on the point where I had been laying, I could feel its non-existent eyes burning into me, and in that moment I realized it had my blood, and it must have been able to sense me in some way that I can't even imagine. There was no other way it could have known that I was there. But it was bound by the pentagram, or at least it seemed to be. So as long as I stayed outside of the pentagram, it couldn't get me. And the girls were still stood around the outside of the pentagram. They kept their heads bowed down as if in some sort of reverence to those smoke figures. But I could see that they were smiling like they had achieved something immense and that they were super happy with themselves. Then slowly the smoke from the last two figures disappeared. It didn't float away like smoke normally would. It just kind of swirled into itself and then vanished. The weight of those eyes never quite left me until the next morning, though. After that, I'd seen enough and I crept away from the villa and back to where I'd left Jordan. It took me a few moments to find where I'd left him. It was almost pitch black beneath those trees and the bushes did almost too good a job of concealing him. But eventually I found him and hunkered down to wait for sunrise. At some point I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I know someone is shaking me awake, and when I open my eyes I can see glimpses of a blue sky past the canopy overhead. I won't bore you with a detailed back and forth of my conversation with Jordan. I'll just give you the TLDR version. He wanted to know what the hell had happened, why we were waking up in the woods, and where his shoe had gone. So I told him everything, and before he could reply, I pulled out my phone and showed him the video. Admittedly, the footage wasn't great, it was dark, I hadn't held it steady, and it didn't seem to pick up the smoky figures. It did, however, show the girls doing their freaky ritual and chanting, and the guys writhing on the ground in agony. To be fair to Jordan, he took it a lot better than I would have, and even though he looked like he had the hangover from hell, he put his game face on and just said, "What do we do now?" And there was only one thing I could think to do at that moment. We had to go take a look and see what was going on back at the house. And that was when I realised we had a bit of an issue. We weren't super deep in the woods, but we were far enough in that we couldn't see the way out, and I wasn't 100% sure which way the villa was. So it took us a little longer to get out of the woods than I had expected. And when we did make it to the edge of the woods, it wasn't at the same spot where we'd entered last night. It turns out the woods actually curve around the side of the villa, so the tree line formed a semicircle with the villa in the middle. And where we came out, rather than just giving us a view of the back of the villa and the patio like last night, we had a view of the side of the house and part of the driveway. And what I saw as I was about to exit the tree line stopped me cold. The three guys from last night are laughing and high-fiving each other as they climb into the back of the minibus from the night before, like nothing had happened other than a good time. And the girls were there waving them off and blowing kisses, like they hadn't drugged them and offered them up as hosts to God knows what. We watch as the minibus pulls off and the girls go back into the villa. Then I see Jordan run out of the tree line towards the villa, and I'm panicking like he's about to do something stupid like go confront those girls. And I'm not looking for a confrontation. I just want to get out there and let the police handle it. We don't know what else these girls are capable of, or what weapons they might have, or if there are any more of those muscle-bound henchmen still hanging around. So I'm calling after him as quietly as I can, telling him to stop. But he doesn't listen. So I start to go after him because, stupid decision or not, I'm not going to let him face them alone. But I get maybe 4 steps out of the tree line when Jordan stops and picks something off the ground. Then he turns and runs back to me with this big grin on his face as he holds up his other shoe. I can't help but laugh, and I guess I couldn't blame him. We did have a long walk to get somewhere with signal so that we could call an Uber. Thankfully, it turns out we were just outside of Rome, and after walking for a couple of hours, we managed to get a lift. By the time we finally managed to get back to the hostel, it was late in the morning, and me and Jordan had had enough time to properly talk through everything that had happened, and as dumb as it sounds, we were actually rethinking contacting the police. What proof did we really have? One shoddy, poorly lit video that didn't even show a crime being committed? Plus, if I mentioned the smoke figures, I'd either be laughed out of the station or thrown in an asylum. The one thing I really wanted was to find the other guys and see if they were okay. When I asked the receptionist if she'd seen them, and I showed her a group photo from the night before, she said that they'd come in earlier that morning, then checked out and left. And that didn't leave me and Jordan with many options. We didn't have any contact info for these guys. It's not like we'd exchanged numbers or even knew their last names to look them up online. So we just had to accept that we were probably never going to hear from those guys again, and had to accept that we weren't going to get any closure from the events of last night. So we did what they did. We got our things and checked out. We'd both been planning to stay in Rome a couple more days, but after that last night, we jumped on the next train down to Napoli, just wanting to put some distance between us and that villa. And again, I have to give credit to Jordan because he was pretty much taking my word for a lot of this. Like I said, that video didn't really show as much as I'd hoped it would, but Jordan, he's a great guy, and I think he could see from how I was acting that I was telling the truth, and he was just happy to move on and explore a new city. And I wish I could say that that was the end of the story, and that I never got any closure on what happened to those other three guys, but a few weeks after that night, I was back home when I received an email from Jordan. In the email, there was a link to a news article dated just a couple days after we'd left Rome. It was about three young men who had tried to break into a restricted section of the Vatican, into the area where the Pope's personal quarters were. When discovered, they stabbed a guard before they were subdued and arrested. I scrolled down to see the mugshots, and it was the three guys that had been with us that night. The three guys that I'd watched inhale those smoky figures. Those guys hadn't seemed like killers. They just seemed like fun guys out for a good time like everyone else. But something had clearly changed that. And this all happened the same day they had checked out of the hostel. So while me and Jordan were catching a train out of Rome, they were trying to break into the Vatican and commit murder. I have no idea why they would want to do that, but I know that the events of that night had something to do with it. Honestly, I wish Jordan hadn't sent me that email because I was happier not knowing that and thinking that they just continued on with their trip and then gone on with their lives.